we know that the Russian representative at the UN said that they have found some evidence that the Ukrainians were behind the terrorist attack in Moscow, and maybe the United States or United Kingdom. And what can we expect from Russian army? How do you see the future of this conflict in Ukraine?
The provocation on March 22nd, where more than 140 Russian citizens were killed in that terrorist attack, is not being taken lightly in Russia. There's great pressure on Putin and the generals to finish the job off. Now, the contrast between the US, which knew immediately that it wasn't Ukraine. It wasn't Ukraine that was behind that attack. It was, it was ISIS. ISIS-K, okay. Even Nebenzia, the Russian representative said, that was bizarre. How could they come up with so quick a statement within 24 hours, We were just starting to look at the evidence, and we have real evidence. The 4 perpetrators, and now other people who were in support. Now we've got their iPhones. We're looking at their iPhones. And we knew, of course, that they were headed to the Ukrainian border. We now know that they had contacts where would they end up in Kiev to a great welcome and so forth. So we're piecing it together. But even we haven't finished, but we know enough to say, yeah, Ukraine was behind these terrorists, and the US and the UK not far behind them, because whatever Ukraine does, pretty much, the US Secret Services and MI6 know completely what they're doing. And when CIA operatives tell the New York Times, as they did about 5 weeks ago, yeah, we trained them in all these tactics, to make covert action. They don't say terrorism, but sometimes we tell them not to do that, but they do it anyway. And what we're going to do, So even the New York Times is sort of warning the U.S. public that the Ukrainians are their own people. They do things sometimes not very much approved by us, but we have to concede that we trained them how to do that, and we created the unit that does that, but they're out of our control. Well, that's a hell of a state of affairs, if I say so myself.
The other thing that we have an article in Financial Times. They're talking about that the United States says China is supplying missile and drone engines to Russia. And it seems that Washington is asking Europe to put some pressure on Beijing to stop sending weapons to Moscow, to Russia. Lavrov was recently in China, meeting with his counterpart, and he said that the relationship between Russia and China is getting to the next level, is getting better and better. And what are the implications of this type of interaction, this type of partnership, alliance, whatever you can call it, between Russia and China for the United States?
Well, this is the most important question because it betokens the tectonic shift in international relations that has taken place over the last 5-10 years, okay? Ukraine and, say Russia and China are now joined at the hip. It was on 4 February 2002 that they signed this strategic document, pretty much tantamount to a military alliance, in which they said there's no upper end to our cooperation, and that has shown itself out in the past. Now, if you look at how U.S. policymakers have reacted to that, well, I don't know if they read the stuff that we say here or other places, But in June of 2001, so for Biden's first year, that was the only one-on-one meeting between Putin and Biden, okay? And not much came of that in terms of readout, except from Biden himself. And as he, before he got on the plane, he said, I'm not supposed to, probably not quite appropriate for me to say what exactly I told Mr. Putin, but he knows that China has this long border with Russia, and that it intends to be a bigger power, a more powerful power, not only economically but militarily. And he knows, and I told him, we realize that you're being squeezed by China, right? Now, Blinken, Sullivan told Biden that that was the case. It was 180 degrees away from the case. And the Russians and the Chinese did all they could for the next couple of years to disprove that, first and foremost, by agreeing that the Chinese would not criticize the Russian invasion of Ukraine. As a matter of fact, the Chinese would support it politically. I should explain. China's long-standing foreign policy is based on the core principle of Westphalia. You don't violate the borders of other countries. You don't get involved in the internal affairs of other countries. You just don't do it. So when Putin was up in Beijing to open the Winter Olympics, 2002, as I said, February 4th, he told Putin, I'm sure he told Putin, look, I'm going to have to invade Ukraine. I know you don't like that. I know it's against their principles, but we wouldn't do this without telling you ahead of time. My notion of how Xi Jinping reacted was, you mean after the Winter Olympics are over, right? Oh, yeah, sure. The Winter Olympics were over on the 20th of February. On the 24th of February, the Russians went into the Donbass, into Ukraine, okay? Now, it wasn't only that, but was a major factor in my view. So there's a meeting on the 4th. Now, they've met once since then, but now they're going to meet again. Lavrov was in Beijing just this past week. He said, yeah, we're preparing a visit for Mr. Putin. We won't set the date yet. The date depends a lot on what happens to Ukraine, I think, okay? Putin wants to be in Beijing talking to Xi Jinping after Putin has decided what he's going to do in Ukraine. And he wants to get, if not Xi Jinping's blessing, at least his acquiescence, his nihil obstat. Yeah, okay, you can do that. That's really important. Now, these people, these sophomores who have been advising Biden and telling them, oh, China's squeezing Russia. Well, I guess they should have told them this is a fraternal embrace. That is that kind of squeeze, okay? Because they're together as never before. And there were two indignities over the past 10 days in Beijing. One was Janet Yellen, the genius who developed policies such as putting a cap on the price of Russian oil. And she's telling the Chinese in public, you're producing too much stuff. You're hurting us economically. You got to produce less stuff. And her interlocutor says, well, we're trying to follow the principles of our market economy. Okay, that's number one provocation. Number two is Lavrov comes in and he talks to not only his opposite number, Yang Yi, but he's received by Xi Jinping himself. Now, they're going to set, as I said, a date for a subsequent summit. And I think that will be probably as important as the one on February the 4th, 2002, because it will be then that China will advise Putin as to how they would react to what Putin decides needs to be done in Ukraine after we see what the House of Representatives does with respect to increased aid, after we see whether people like J.D. Vance are able to convince people that this is a really bad idea because there are no men and there are no weapons and so forth, just to see how that all carries out. Meanwhile, the Russians are doing attrition. That's what they do. The word now is attrit. They attrit and they attrit and they attrit some more. And they're doing the kind of attrition that is just devastating with these heavy bombs, devastating the fortifications that Ukraine did have time to put in a year or two ago. They are no more. There's very little in the way of a Russian march to the Dnieper River. Now, atypically, well, maybe I just say McGovern doesn't think Putin wants to do that. Why? Look at the map, for God's sake. Russians, look at the map, okay? Does Putin want to be responsible for counterinsurgency in all that territory between what he has now and the Dnieper River? I don't think so. So I really do think he's ready to make a deal. It's just that the deal will be a real tough deal, much tougher than the one that was agreed to in April of 2002. So all this is in flux, but the notion that Yellen would come in and then the highest, well, the president himself would say, China is the fly in the ointment here. China is building up the Russian economy so that they're going to win in Ukraine. My God. So he's going to blame China for Russia winning in Ukraine? In my knowledge, China has not supplied much in the way of actual military hardware. Russia has not needed that. They've gotten a lot from North Korea, apparently, not from China. China's given them tons of money for the oil that they produce and so forth. And they have, of course, bolstered the Russian economy to the point where it has a positive growth about 3% last year, where everybody else in Europe had negative growth. So in that sense, yeah, China's in with Russia, but you can't blame China, as is happening now. Actually, the Deputy Secretary of State pretty much said, I don't remember the quote, but he said, look, if Russia wins in Ukraine, it's because China fortified their economy. And we're going to hold the Chinese responsible. These people have no concept of the limits of what used to be predominant, exceptional, indispensable US power. It ain't there no more, but they don't realize it. That's what's dangerous. Biden himself gets up and says, Putin has already lost in Ukraine. He's already lost. That was July of last year. So 7, 5, I don't know what the math is, but here it is, what, April, April of the following year. Nobody asks, what are all these White House correspondents do? Why don't they say, hey, wait a second, Mr. President, you said in July that Putin already lost, so why do you need $60 billion more dollars? I mean, it doesn't parse, Mr. President. Well, you're wrong. Who told you that? Who told you that? Never asked. Okay. Now, just as a codicil to this, today in the New York Times, a prominent Republican senator, J.D. Vance, has an incredibly frank and open op-ed. Interesting that appears in the New York Times. I'll just read you a sentence or two about it because it's the mark, right? The issue, of course, is whether the House should join the Senate in appropriating $60 billion more for Ukraine. And Vance says, President Biden wants us to believe that the biggest obstacle facing Ukraine is Republicans like me, J.D. Vance. Ukraine's challenge is not the Republicans. It's mathematics. Ukraine needs more soldiers than it can get. It needs more materiel than the US or anyone else can provide. This is the reality that should inform any future Ukraine policy from congressional aid to the diplomatic course that should be set by the president. So he's got it all right there encapsulated, okay? There aren't enough people in the Ukrainian army. There aren't enough arms to give them. And I would just add, even if we had the arms to give them, we couldn't get the arms there early enough to prevent Russian forces from moving as far west as they want, because they're on the move now, and they have very little between them and the Dnieper River. So J.D. Vance is saying, look, you Republicans, you fellow party members in the House, please be aware, if you vote against pouring good money after bad to the tune of 60 billion, it's not going to change the course of the war. And that's the bottom line. The trajectory is very clear. There is nothing in God's earth or heaven that can change the trajectory. And the trajectory. And I'll just finish by citing Secretary Austin, who said more than a year ago that we are willing to move heaven and earth to make sure that Ukraine defeats Russia. Whoa, heaven and earth. Well, he's not going to be able to do that. And yet, when he's asked by one of the senators this past week, can Ukraine still win? He says, yes, Ukraine can still win. Now, he's either even dumber, he's either very dumb or he's lying, because it's not the case Ukraine can win, except, and this is, as you know, Nima, what scares me. The only tool in the toolbox the U.S. has left would be the deployment, use, or threatened use of low-yield nuclear weapons. My God, would they resort to that? Well, to prevent definitive defeat in Ukraine and definitive defeat in the election? I wouldn't rule it out, because I've watched these fellows too long. They have a personal stake in this too. If that other fellow comes in and becomes president, they could actually spend some jail time. So that's what has me really worried. And it doesn't matter how worried McGovern is, of course. I think Putin looks on these things in a similar way. I've spent a whole career trying to put myself in the shoes of Russian leaders. I mean, it's a no-brainer. You'd have to be afraid of these people because they're unpredictable, because they don't seem to have much good sense. And we'll have to see how they react now. Whether this bill is approved or not, most people will realize that it's really mostly beneficial to the upper elite, which will profiteer on these. On 2/3 of this money will stay in the United States, and the rest will go to Ukraine, and God knows where it ends up once it goes to Ukraine. So to the degree the American people will wake up and read, actually, New York Times, J.D. Vance today, the more hope there is that this thing can be tamped down. And again, are the Russians willing to negotiate? It's almost embarrassing. They say that every other day. Yes, we are, but not on that bizarre formula that Zelensky gave out over a year ago. Well, we have to not only be defeated, but pay indemnities. Not on the basis of that formula. We'll talk, but not on that basis. And I can understand that. Look at what Zelensky's formula is.